Hello, and welcome to the Prof Talk Pod. My name is Becky Achen, and I am currently a professor of the practice at the University of Kansas. And I'm really excited to talk to you about just things that are happening in higher education, things that impact us as educators, and even just as individuals trying to work in this space and help students get better at their craft and go out into society and contribute to the world. So, we're going to cover a lot of different topics on this podcast, things like how to improve your teaching, how students learn, just issues that might be impacting higher education. And to start, we have a really exciting one that I'm sure many of you are thinking about, just given that the semester started and maybe you even graded an assignment and you're starting to consider how you can tackle generative AI and its use in your classroom. With me, I've got my friend and fellow professor, Dr. Galen Clavio.
Thanks, Becky. Great to be on and good to see you and excited to be part of this. Looking forward to getting this thing underway.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So, I also have been writing for about 8 months a newsletter on LinkedIn called Prof Talk. So, I would encourage you to connect with me on LinkedIn and check out that newsletter. I'm trying to use that as a way to provide actionable tips and strategies that you can implement into your classroom and hopefully help improve some of your teaching. And every once in a while, you just need a new idea. I know we all have centers for teaching and learning or teaching excellence on our college campuses, but sometimes our schedules just don't allow us to engage in their events or attend their pod or their webinars or whatever it is that they have going on. So I'm hopeful that that short, usually they're like a 7 to 10 minute read, can be helpful for you. And also, you're welcome to send me any ideas or topics that you love to hear more about or think more about, and I'll do some research and give you some tips and tricks. So let's dive into talking a little bit about the use of generative AI in the classroom. So I don't know if this happened with you, Galen, or not, but I think the last like 18 months, almost every time I've had a conversation with a friend or a colleague, they're starting to think about, I got this great assignment from a student. They'd never written like that before. And suddenly they can write with flowing phrases and lots of adjectives, and they know everything that they need to know for the class. And they say, I just don't know how that can be true. And I'm really worried that it's generative AI that's helping them with their homework. And I think that's been a conversation I've had probably 100 times in the last 18 months.
Yeah, it's certainly something I deal with. I'm also the associate dean for undergraduate education here at the media school. So I get it in my own classes, but I hear it a lot from other professors. And yeah, it's about 18 months. And I'd say, especially in the last 6 months or so, like tail end of spring semester and certainly coming into fall, it's suddenly become an issue a lot of people are cognizant of and worried about.
Yeah, and I think part of it, sometimes we're a little behind the times in higher ed in terms of technology and tools like that. Oftentimes our students hear and see them before we do. And part of that is just because many of us are so interested in our research or we're doing service. And so we just don't have time to keep up with the things that are happening that may impact how our students are engaging in our courses or learning. But I know that a lot of my colleagues are kind of at a loss right now, feeling like they're almost powerless in what do I do to kind of improve or encourage my students to learn while still allowing them to, engage with these tools that I know they might have to use in their jobs. So that's something that I was in a weird position in November 2022 when generative AI started really being easily accessible. And so I was teaching like 6 classes across many different universities. So I think that helped me see right away, like, oh, wow, students are using this all across the country in different ways. And so I really started thinking about ways that students could um, be using generative AI and how I could help them still like force them to engage with my content. And so some of the challenges that I've been seeing, and I don't know some of the challenges you've been hearing, is just, students copying and pasting prompts for written assignments and submitting them directly in as work, which it's fine work, right? It's like B level from a grade perspective, but it's difficult because you know that that means they maybe didn't read one thing or watch one thing or actually learn anything, which I think for a lot of us is why we're here.
Right. Part of the issue is, I think, for most academics of this particular generation, and certainly this was the case with previous generations, but we learned if we were ever taught how to teach, which generally speaking, you kind of are supposed to learn how to do that on your own in this industry. It's one of the dirty little secrets of the field. Um, you looked at written work as kind of the default way to get people to read things because, well, if they don't read, it's going to show up in the writing. And while that was technically true, it was also a little bit lazy, I think, on the part of instructors. And I've been guilty of this. This is not me casting aspersions on other people, without also pointing the finger at myself. It's a reliable way to say, go read this, go write something about it, boom. Well, generative AI basically means that's not a reasonable way of going about things anymore. And I think there's a lot of hostility and resentment towards generative AI in a bunch of different fields. And it's different for every field. Like, I think for business related fields, I understand the resentment. I work in media primarily. I'm a sports media professor. And I can't, in good conscience, say don't use generative AI, students, because they're going to need to learn how to use that in the workplace. It's more than about, well, if you're going to use generative AI, you need to make sure that the answer that you're giving is actually correct. But that requires more work on the part of the professor, because now you're having to really go through with fine details, not focus on simple things like grammar, which was always an easy way to dock people points, and instead focus on, like, well, what did they write? And did it actually make sense? And I do think there's a resistance among some faculty to doing that, because it does mean just a whole bunch of extra work in the grading process. And that can be a hard thing to get your head wrapped around.
Yeah, and that's such a good point because we don't get taught how to teach. And that's part of the reason why I started wanting to write about it because so many of us didn't get taught how to teach. And I felt like I was slogging through learning how to do it. Still am slogging through learning how to teach on a daily basis. And this was just like another thing. Like you said, we have to figure out what can we do to encourage our students to still engage with course content, come to class, think deeply about the things that we're talking about, and learn while also supporting their use of generative AI. And similar to you in marketing, that's boy, that field just grabbed generative AI and went running with it. Whether that's good or bad, we could probably debate. There was already a lot of bad content out there. So I think we might be putting a lot more out there only faster. But the students who are going to work in that field, that's going to be their daily lives. And that's why right away I immediately, I wanted to think about how can I still get students to learn but and teach them these tools can be part of that learning process. And I think for me, and as I thought about it, it was really what can I do in my assignments and in my in course work that's different that pushes them to still try to learn something, but also teaches them and shows them examples of how we can support that learning using generative AI tools. What are some appropriate uses of those for my class, which might look different than your class, or a class in history, or a class in geology? But if we all sit down and really think critically about what we want our students to really know and be able to do when they leave our classes, and then think about, okay, how does generative AI support that process? And how can we build assignments, like you said, that might be more than just writing what they think about what they learned or writing a research paper that they can relatively easily do on generative AI? How do we create assignments in ways that force them or push them to still engage in that process?
I will say there's an interesting philosophical concept here that I've been struggling with generative AI. Think about when the calculator came into regular circulation. And there was a debate around that time. It's like, well, if people can't do these calculations by hand, then people won't actually learn math. No one says that anymore. And the calculator is essentially the original generative AI device, where it's like, hey, this complicated quadratic equation, oops, let me plug it in to this calculator. And as long as I know how to plug it in, I get that back. And so I do, to some degree, I think about the way that we conceptualize learning and the idea of, well, what is learning? Is it memorization? Is it retention of information? Is retention of information as important in an era when, barring a societal collapse, which is not out of the question, but barring a societal collapse, you're going to have access to materials at your fingertips. Like, you don't need to necessarily retain bits and pieces of information. You're going to be able to look those up very quickly. So what are we trying to get students to learn in the first place? And this is where I think every area, every discipline has to really conceptualize, like, what are we doing with this? It's not about, you need to know these core concepts and ideas. It's more like you need to know how to apply them to different types of information, and you have access to all that information, but can you take it to the level where you're actually synthesizing it, where you're up in that top level of Bloom's taxonomy, where you're really, you're not just regurgitating the information, you're applying it to a specific example or set of examples. And so a lot of it to me, as I think about it that way, is whatever your discipline is, focus on the higher level conceptualization of the material, not just read this and tell me what it said or tell me what you think it meant. Because it's not even like, I mean, ChatGPT or these other generative AI items, if you're doing those sorts of things, it will also spit out for you scenarios. Like, it's not just a matter of, tell me what happened in the the War of 1812. It'll also tell you a bunch of individual scenarios that you can type in and prompt it. So it's really, I think, more about figuring out what can I do to get the student to internalize the information and then come up with something different, not just telling me what it was. And that's a hard thing to develop assignments for.
And especially again, when we're back to we weren't taught how to teach or develop assignments, or many of us even come up with learning outcomes for a class. So now we're saying it's going to be harder to create things that actually push engagement with students. I think that what you said though is actually maybe hopefully for a lot of us quite freeing when you think about it, because so much of the time, you get behind in one class and you're like, oh no, the content, not the content. I won't get it all covered. Now what will I do? And, in an era where we don't need rote memorization, potentially, but there's still jobs that you're going to need that. If you're a physician and you're in a life or death situation, you need to make a decision now. You do still need to have remember or have remembered some of these core concepts. Absolutely. But
I'll
there's a lot
note,
of
I'll note
instances.
that neither Becky nor I teach medicine,
No,
fortunately. So yeah.
yeah, thank goodness. I wanted to be a doctor for all of bio 1, and then I was like, "I'm good. I'm out."
Yeah.
But
I didn't
yeah,
even
so
think that far. So go on, please.
but that's part of it, is like it should hopefully be a little freeing to think if we can focus on some of those higher level learning outcomes that most of us actually enjoy trying to push students that far anyway and worry less about did I cover all of the basic facts that they have to know or they can't function in this job, that might actually make our courses better too, more engaging. We could talk about this for hours. We haven't even talked about how the value of higher ed is often questioned and what are students really getting that they can't just get in an online, course on LinkedIn or on Coursera or any of those websites. Do they need institutions of higher education? And we were going to get to this point anyway. I think generative AI pushed us here quicker. And you're right, the core is maybe going back and taking a step back in your discipline, whether that's with colleagues at your own institution or at other institutions, and talking about what is it that we really care students can leave our program and actually be able to do. And if it's solve problems and think analytically, then we can redesign our assignments around that and put generative AI as part of their process to problem solving.
So one of the first things I recommend to people in this area is go use generative AI yourself. As a professor, go take the prompt that you're giving a student in an exam or in a homework assignment, put it in, see what it gives you. And that will help you, I think, initially understand what sorts of things students will be looking. And first of all, I do think it's important to note it's easy to criticize students for being lazy, in air quotes, or whatever, but I always think about students the way I think about water. Like, water finds the path of least resistance to get to where it needs to get to. It's not like, oh, here's a rock, I'm going to plow through this rock. It might do it over thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, but in the moment, it's just going to run around the rock. That's essentially what students do. And unless you get students really invested in the learning and synthesis process in your classes, if someone comes in and you're really able to sell them on the idea, like, I want you to commit to this, you're probably going to end up with a situation where they look at your class like any other class, and it's like, what do I need to do with the minimum amount of work to get through this? Understand that psychology. You might debate that psychology. You might have been the unique person who didn't feel that way in school, but realistically, that's what a lot of your students are doing. And so I always start with that. It's like, first of all, figure out, yes, students are going to look for the path of least resistance. So if you know what those are by looking at ChatGPT or these other generative AI processes and figuring out, well, here's what they'll get, figure out how you can tweak what you're asking them so that it's not so simple as plugging things in. What a lot of times what I'll do is, I'll have specific readings and in an exam where they don't have the time or the ability to use generative AI, they'll have to answer a conceptual question, but they'll have to sprinkle in specific examples from the readings, which is very hard for generative AI to copy. And it's very hard on the fly for somebody to go in and try to intersperse those things into an existing answer because it quickly becomes incoherent. So a lot of it is really asking better questions and really trying to dig in to the types of questions that you're putting in front of students. That's going to give them a much harder time taking the path of least resistance, but it's also going to cause them to actually think about the material, which is really what you're aiming for in the first place with this.
And I think paired along with that is thinking about the way that you are grading and creating rubrics to assess their success in whatever assignment it is that you're asking. And to, I think, my students' annoyance, I have gotten really picky about citing course content in their work, in all of their work, discussion boards, reflections, papers, exam questions, all of it, not because I think if they don't know APA citations, they won't be successful in the world of sport management or marketing or whatever it is, but because I want them to see that they need to demonstrate they engaged with the course content. This is my way of trying to hold them accountable on top of thinking about how they might have an argument or a discussion in their job and they need to support what they are saying with actual information. I think it's kind of a dual purpose there.
Yeah.
So I've really focused grading rubrics on, yeah, this is technically accurate, but did you take course content and show me that you read it to know that this is technically accurate? Again, I think it's annoying 50% of my students, but I try to front end in all my classes by explaining like this is how I approach teaching and I want you to learn something and I don't really care if you know the right answers. I just want you to know more tomorrow than you did the day before. And hopefully that's helping. I should do a research project on that and get student perceptions and see.
I know. Well, so in a similar vein, like a lot of times what I've done when I was teaching in the sport management field, I would give them a scenario where they had to create in their mind a team or an organization and then apply what we were learning to that. That's very hard for generative AI to come up with because they have to come up with the details that fill in the answer. And yes, the core of the answer is still going to be probably something that generative AI could come up with, but it's the details that end up becoming a big part of the rubric. And this idea that you're conceptualizing a world in your own head that fits the world that exists in whatever you're studying. And that generally, not only does that help with this process, but it also gets people a little more excited because they're essentially role playing at that point. And yes, it does take a little bit longer to grade, but I really do think that it helps people learn better. I think that one of the most successful assignments I ever had was it was a sports marketing class, and we were learning about some aspect of the marketing mix. And we utilized whatever year's version of Madden that was, and they had to actually create their own team, expansion team with its own front office. And they had to like name all the people in the front office. And that really didn't matter. What mattered was how they were relating to the core items, but it became their project. It became something that they felt an ownership of because it was more than just bringing things back up from the book. And I think that for something, and this was long before generative AI, but that kind of thing really does, in my experience, get students more engaged. A lot of the problem in a lot of these areas is that we just rely on whatever the example questions are that come with the book. And those are generally really bad. I've written a book where I had to write example questions, and they suck. They're really terrible, and they're not engaging the students. And so, if you could figure out a way to take those items and tweak them, it's like that's there's a scene from a movie where it's like you don't have to memorize an entire joke. You remember the important parts and you make the rest of it your own, and that ultimately is the key, I think, to wrapping people's brains in class around the idea that they're doing more than just giving you the same boring things that they expect to give in every other class.
Yeah, and I think to kind of pair with that is if you can do any kind of industry partnership. I know that doesn't work for everyone. But, if you have a small organization that needs, help with a marketing plan. So when I have students work in on sport marketing plans and create promotion plans, I try to do it with a minor league team with their partnership, and they have to present it to them. So that does two things. One, generative AI does not have information about a single A team, like not enough to create an entire promotion strategy. They have to do the research, they have to come up with ideas. And two, when you make them present it to an actual client, they're less likely to kind of phone it in because they see this as being a real experience, right? Anything that you can do to get them in front of what they consider to be a real experience in front of professionals in your field, I think is those kind of assignments are also going to engage them in the learning process. And that's, you mentioned buy-in earlier, and I think that's so much of this is that, as much as I think a lot of faculty hate to hear this, like part of our job is to create buy-in in our students and in our classes and help them see why this matters. And then the outcomes are better if they see how they're important in the process, and why the outcome isn't important for them if in their future careers or just being an engaged member of society.
Yeah, no, you've got to sell the material. You've got to sell the reason why the material is important. And I do think there's a lot of faculty that struggle with that because many of them were students at a time when the expectation was you were going to learn it whether or not you felt it was something that was worth learning or not. And you cannot like that all you want, but the reality is we're in an era where students need to be engaged and they need to have the material kind of sold to them, or at least contextualized in a way where it's like, okay, I could see how this is conceptually interesting. And look, I look at a ton of student evaluations, and even in classes that aren't necessarily that exciting or don't have particularly relevant material, it would appear, to the present day. The teachers that get the best evaluations are the ones who understand, hey, what I'm teaching might not seem that exciting, but let me put it in a context that you will understand, or put it in a context of something that you realize is relevant to your day-to-day life or what you consume in pop culture or whatnot. And that helps. It really does. And I think within this, again, it's like if you can take that and you can have them give answers through the window of what's going on and what they're familiar with, you should be able to do that. Like there's very few things that are so abstract in nature that they don't have some kind of a quote unquote real world analog that you could talk through. But again, a lot of it really comes down to then what are you prompting them to do? One of the things I've been trialing in my own classes is I used to require a paper. And for many of the reasons that you outlined at the beginning, I was like, this is no longer going to work. And it probably wasn't a good idea to begin with. It was just me wanting a layup in terms of what I was grading. Now I make them put together, I still have them do a research thing, but I have them either put together a video or a podcast. And even if I've got students, and yes, I'm a media professor, but I teach sports media and I largely teach an industry focused class. But my philosophy on it is, a lot of times in workplaces that people will eventually be going into, including academia, I will note, you're going to be asked just as often to create dynamic media as you're going to be asked to create written media. And if you can put together your thoughts in a podcast or a video, even if you went and chat GPT'd the entire answer, you still have to go through the process of putting it all together, which means you're learning because you're reviewing that material, you're having to deliver that material. It's much different than just writing it down. And it doesn't have to be fancy. I mean, I have students that record podcasts on their voice memos app on their iPhone. It doesn't have to be this ornate thing. I always tell our students, like, you got your iPhone. This has about $100,000 worth of audio and video equipment from 10, 20 years ago, just walking around in your pocket. That is, to me, like, why not use that? And again, the answer is generally, well, it takes too long to grade. But I'm sorry, like a 5-minute podcast on a topic takes no longer to grade than a 5-page paper on a topic if you're doing it right. And you're focusing on different things. You're no longer focusing necessarily on grammar. You're focusing on, did you make a coherent argument? Did you give good detailed examples? Did you refer to some of the things that we talked about in class or that were talked about in the readings? To me, once I made that switch in my brain and I was like, I don't mind listening to 30 of these podcasts or watching them, suddenly it was like, I actually like this better because it allows people to tell stories in their own ways and not feel so constrained by the written aspects of the language. And that really is a concern that we tend to just ignore when we ask for these papers. Sometimes people cannot communicate particularly well in written form, but can do a lot better in oral form.
Yeah, that's also one of my favorite assignments. So for non-media professors, that also worked for me in a course in sport leadership. I was able to have them create a podcast around they read a book on leadership and then we talked about leadership theories in class and they created a podcast to talk about what they learned in the book, how they saw it reflected in the course and how sport managers could use it as leaders in the industry and how they would apply it in their own career. And similarly, yeah, they could have definitely gotten a script from generative AI, but I care about them learning something, and if it means that they have to read that script back, then at least they will have learned something from
Right.
having to do the process of it. And I think it's so good for students to see different types of assignments in the classes because I don't know about you, but I often get students who say, "This is exactly what I've always done," or "This is not, this is I just don't do this very well, and so I'm not gonna do well in your class." It's kind of like students who used to say, "I'm not a good test taker."
Yep.
Well, students also are not always good writers, but you have that student in your class. We've all had that student, right, who responds to every question. They have really well thought out points in class. They're always engaged in class, but then you read their 10-page term paper and you're like, "Oh my goodness, this isn't incoherent." But you know that they know the stuff. So this
Right.
gives students multiple opportunities. And if you can do different types of assignments like that in your class, you don't have to change every single assignment you do into a
No.
video or podcast. It's just varying it enough that it pushes them to learn something and helps you teach them in that process how to use generative AI to help write the script and organize their thoughts and create a list of, potential topics they want to cover, but then they do the work of actually recording it. And so it
Yeah.
becomes part of the process then, and that's real. That's what life is going to be like when they get out into the world.
I also think there's an issue with scale here that we need to talk about, which is, the problem is for a lot of classes, they're large scale classes. There's more than 50 people in them. And a lot of the things that you would use to combat generative AI utilization in class are, let's do in-class assignments where they're working on things individually, but they're doing it on momentary prompts. We can't really do that with 150 people in a class. You so much of what we've done in the past has been, well, we've got to get this huge number of students through this topic, and so we're going to try to educate as many of them as possible. And I do think that there are changes that have to be made in the overall educational structure that are not likely coming soon. I mean, let's be honest with ourselves here, where if you're going to do that type of a class, you're going to have to accept that you either can't really use written answers very easily within them because students are just going to use generative AI to answer them, and there's not really a good way to do quality control checks on a lot of those, at least not yet. Or you're going to have to um, figure out another way to assess on a broad scale whether or not students are learning items, and that is very difficult to do. I don't have a good answer for that one yet, but I think there's a fundamental, so much of the educational structure in terms of undergraduate education was built upon the idea that at the end of the day, the students would still have to do the work. We're in an era where that may not necessarily be the case. And that is going to be really fascinating, I think, to watch unfold over the next 10 years, because right now they don't necessarily have to do the work in the way a lot of these courses are structured. And I don't see an easy fix on the horizon.
Yeah, the large class sizes is an interesting point, and maybe the easy fix is no more large class sizes. But I don't see that happening. We both
As an,
work at
as
very large universities.
as an associate dean for undergrad at a school with 50,000 people, yeah, you just gave me the shakes with that. I mean, it's just more just, and it's like, I would love it if we had nothing but smaller classes. I don't have the faculty to teach all of those sections. I mean,
No.
and that is a real concern. And I just think it's one of those things from a policy perspective that smart people at universities are going to have to think about, because, much like the calculator example I referenced earlier, like, this isn't going to go away and it's not going to get worse. It's going to get better. And I do think we just need to start having some fundamental shifts in how we think about education, because if we're really here, as I hear over and over again in higher ed, that we're here to teach students how to think, then the generative AI stuff really shouldn't be that much of an obstacle. It's the way that you're assessing whether students are learning how to think that's the obstacle. And I think it, to some degree, highlights how we haven't actually been assessing that very easily over the course of the last 50 or so years. What we've been assessing is, did you actually show up and write the paper that regurgitated what you learned? Because ChatGPT can, or and others, they can create what looks like a fairly coherent argument for why X, Y, and Z would be the case. So find other ways to do it. And I think we're still all struggling with the answers on that, but it's important to fundamentally understand the question.
Well, and I just real quick, I want to give an example of a colleague who told me they had a 120 person, intro to, I can't remember what class, but intro to something class. And they actually did use 2-minute oral exams for their students instead of a regular exam, which takes, I'm not trying to do the math right now. It takes you a few hours to do, but that that is a way to potentially rethink examinations or presentations. There's some really great uh, templates out there for short, quick hitting presentations that you could do in a large class that, might completely change the effort for the professor, but that's okay.
Well, the one problem we do have to think about, and that we deal with this a lot more now with adaptive technologies and with accommodation services for students, is that some students have accommodations where they can't get in front of classes, and so there are a lot of other challenges when you're changing the assessment structure at this point. And again, I think it's an ongoing conversation. I guess my take home point on a lot of it is maybe we need to be thinking about ChatGPT as a tool, not as an enemy. And I think the more that you can incorporate, yes, I want you to use generative AI in this assignment as part of the assignment. And here's the part that you use it in. But then there's another part of the assignment where you're not using it because maybe this actually are your students doing the reading? This becomes the question. Were they doing it in the first place or not? Because that there's plenty of services out there that have example responses. We've seen that when we look at Turnitin and other items. Like, there's clearly papers being reused. So that's just a different form of the same problem. So now you've got essentially something that's available to everybody in generative AI. So instead of fighting it, maybe welcome it in, but say this is going to be something that you utilize alongside of what you're doing, and here's how you should utilize it. That may end up being the better long-term solution.
Yeah, so that's going to be a great teaser too for a next episode about the concept of ungrading, which I think could really also help us reconsider how we're assessing student work and take out some of that right and wrongness. And that changes the way that generative AI becomes, again, part of the process. And so we'll talk more about that in our next episode. But the ungrading concept really is about the process. And maybe that's the solution, right? Is we need to grade process and not outcome, and that completely changes how generative AI is used as part of that. So yeah, I think your takeaway is really, really great, that thinking about generative AI as an enemy is just not going to work. As much as I would love to sit down and discuss whether it's plagiarism or not, it doesn't actually matter, because you are not going to, one, the detection tools are not very good, research has shown that, and two, students have to know how to use these things in the world past college. So saying you can't use it is not going to work. And if you've ever had kids, the one thing that happens when you tell them they can't do something is they just try to do it without you knowing, even harder than they were before.
That's exactly right. Now it'll be an interesting pathway for a lot of people. And I think it's something that we need to start having conversations about now and figuring out how do we get it more closely involved in the learning process. And I don't think there's going to be easy solutions to that, but I think we'll figure them out.
Yeah, absolutely. So just real quick, wrapping it up, some ideas for you all as you think about the use of generative AI and how you can create assignments that push your students in different ways and make generative AI part of the process is, you know, talk to your colleagues, right? We gave you a couple ideas, but talk to people, have the conversations, try not to divert into, well, is this right or wrong? Try to really focus on what can we do to move forward, and visit your centers for teaching and learning. There's tons of online resources. Follow the Prof Talk LinkedIn newsletter. I don't talk only about AI in it. We won't only talk about AI on the podcast. We'll talk about other topics too, but there's tons of resources out there. So really encourage you to push yourself and talk to other people and just try new things. And if they fail, fine, but you got to try to move forward and keep these dialogues and conversations open. Well, thank you, Dr. Clavio, for joining today. I'm excited already for our next episode, and I hope that you all have a wonderful start of the semester.